Hi everyone, welcome to Water Bear Reads. My name is Heather. Happy New Year! I hope everyone is having a wonderful New Year so far. If you're new to my channel, I love to read illustrated classics and modern classics. I love reading while appreciating art at the same time. I started doing this when I was reading chapter books to my son. I would research illustrated versions of classics and I'd read it to him. And we started making these lists where we read one book from each decade, from 1900 to the present, as well as one book from the 1800s. And so today I want to share one of those with you, and I've picked out some of the titles that I feel really have a winter feel to them. So I hope you enjoy it. I have my hot chocolate here, and I just had a lovely stroll. It is so beautiful and snowy. We had another layer of snow come out just last night. The real nice powdery type, and it's just wonderful. So let me take a sip of hot chocolate and we'll get started. Starting with the 1800s, and the first book on my list that I wanted to show you, published in 1865, is Hans Brinker or the Silver Skates. I read the version illustrated by Cyrus Leroy Baldridge. This is a wonderful book that is a coming of age, it's a rivalry plot, it has a bit of rags to riches, also a bit of mystery. It's set in the Netherlands and it opens in December, and it has a couple of chapters that have Christmas in them. So it's nice to read around Christmas time, but really it's just a great winter read. We have 15-year-old Hans Brinker and his younger sister Gretel. And Hans and Gretel are living in poverty. Their father had an accident where he was left mentally disabled. And his mother's looking after them, and she's growing vegetables and sewing and doing what she can to keep the family afloat. There was some savings, but it has mysteriously disappeared. So the family's trying to just survive. Hans and Gretel are skating around on wooden skates because they can't afford metal skates. And then we also have two other characters. We have Hilda, who is this very, very kind girl, and also Peter, who is also kind, but he's more of a sort of a leader of a group of boys. And through their efforts, they give Hans and Gretel a chance to compete in a competition where you can win some beautiful silver skates. And it's really exciting, especially towards the end. There's references to Don Quixote and Puss in Boots and Gulliver's Travels, which we really enjoyed. Mary Mapes Dodge was the first editor of St. Nicholas magazine, which is a very well-known, well-cherished magazine from the time period, and it launched several authors' careers. I came across it for the first time when I was researching. Rudyard Kipling got his start in St. Nicholas magazine when he published pieces of the Jungle Book in the magazine. Incidentally, it was also where Frances Hodgson Burnett got her start. She published Little Lord Fauntleroy in St. Nicholas magazine, as well as a short story version of A Little Princess. So Mary Mapes Dodge was actually a very important player in the world of children's literature. One thing I do want to say is in the middle of the book, you are getting fed a lot of Dutch history and information on Dutch architecture and Dutch culture. You follow Peter and his friends as they go on a 40-mile journey to visit his sister, and as they're skating, you get introduced to so many aspects of life in the Netherlands. Especially if you're reading to a younger kid, it does get a bit tedious. And the reason that Mary Mapes Dodge did that is because back in her day, books were the way you provided information to children and taught them about other places from other lands. And so she just put a lot of facts in this book. If you just want to get back to the main story, you can just skip those chapters in the middle. You can pretty much page through and see where they are. There is a bit of excitement that does happen in the middle, but none of it is really central to the story. I have both of these versions, and they're both illustrated by Cyrus Leroy Baldridge. I went ahead and read this one because even on the pages that are not illustrated, you still have these little embellishments, which are just wonderful to have when you're reading. So many gorgeous illustrations and beautiful winter scenes. There's also full-page illustrations. There's another one. Cyrus Leroy Baldridge was a rather adventurous artist. He traveled all over the world. He began life in New York and then traveled around the country with his mother, who was a peddler and a seamstress herself. and went from place to place, and it kind of imbued him with a need for travel. He was educated in Chicago and served in World War I as an illustrator, and he eventually moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and lived there till the end of his life. I also noticed that he illustrated a version of Lassie Come Home by Eric Knight, as well as a Christmas book I had never heard of called Santa Comes to America. If you're reading to younger children, you might enjoy this picture book version, which condenses the story and highlights the main parts of the story. And the illustrations by Laurel Long are just so beautiful. When I saw it, I couldn't get over it. It was so pretty. My library has it. I don't own this copy, but I just love to take it out. And it's just gorgeous. Now we are in the 1900s, and published in 1906 is White Fang by Jack London. And this is a beautiful story of rebirth. It's set in the late 1890s in the Canadian Klondike, as well as later on in Sierra Vista, California. The main characters are White Fang and Weedon Scott. It's a story of a wolf-dog hybrid, White Fang, and he's born in the wild and he becomes domesticated. And in this process of domestication, he is mistreated, badly mistreated, and he grows to distrust humans. He grows angry. He soon becomes identified as a great dog for dog fights. He's manipulated and used until one day Weedon Scott comes along, and through patience and understanding and love, Weedon Scott turns White Fang around. And it's just the most beautiful story. What really touched me about this story is that even though it's about an animal, a dog, the value that struck me upon finishing this book was that it not only relates to animals, but also to humans. What can go wrong in human society as well. How criminals are made. It's an interesting study. It's just such a testament to how mistreatment can affect trust. The version I read is this beautifully illustrated version by Usborne Illustrated Originals, and it is illustrated by Utah-based James Masden, who you might know if you are familiar with the Nevermore series. And it's gorgeous. It's really well illustrated. So pretty. And another. Some of the illustrations are also just sepia or one color. It's illustrated throughout and it's beautiful. And if you're reading to a child, it's a great version to go with. Also, if you're reading to a younger child, I wanted to show you this version of White Fang. It's the Classic Adventures series from Starry Forest Books. And it's illustrated by Liza Trechakova. And I just think they're so beautiful. I love all their books. I mean, look at those end papers. And there's so many gorgeous descriptions of winter in White Fang too. There's Weedon Scott and White Fang. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it yet. Published in 1906, White Fang. So now we are in the 1910s, and the next book is full of enchantment and mystery and is set in the austere yet beautiful landscapes of Norway. And that is East of the Sun, West of the Moon, Old Tales from the North, illustrated by Kai Nielsen. These tales were first collected by Peter Christian Abjornsen and Jørgen Moe in the 1800s. But the reason I decided to go with this version for the 1910s is because this iconic version, illustrated by Kai Nielsen, came out in 1914. And this book by Taschen is a 100th anniversary republication of that version. And his illustrations for East of the Sun, West of the Moon are just so iconic and beautiful, and he is a Golden Age illustrator, very well known. It is such a pleasure to wake up in the morning and get my coffee or my hot cocoa and settle down and read one or two of these tales. The actual story of East of the Sun, West of the Moon is one of just 15 tales placed in this collection, and 2 of these tales were published for the very first time in this collection. One of them is actually a Danish tale from a different collector, and the name of that one is Prince Lindworm, and it's another variant of the Beauty and the Beast tale, which also East of the Sun, West of the Moon is as well a variant of the Beauty and the Beast tale. The most famous of these tales would probably be the Three Billy Goats Gruff, that you would, I'm sure, recognize. Let me show you some of the illustrations. They have several of these double-page spreads with Kai Nielsen's artwork, and it's just beautiful. This illustration is from Prince Lindworm that I just spoke about, and I really love this tale. It's probably one of my favorites in the book. It's about a prince who was born as a snake, And it's not until he is treated in a certain way by a woman that he is changed back to his human state, his very handsome human state. This is from a story called The Giant Who Had No Heart in His Body, which, incidentally, this artwork on the cover is also from that story. If it looks a bit familiar to you, you might recognize Kai Nielsen's style from Disney's vintage Sleeping Beauty, as well as Fantasia. If you hear the heating, that's just our heating pipes going on. And they just turned on, so. But later in his life, he worked for Disney and worked on Sleeping Beauty and Fantasia, as well as I think he got some posthumous accreditation for The Little Mermaid. Now we are in the 1920s, and the book I wanted to chat about from the 1920s is Flower Fairies of the Winter by Cicely Mary Barker. Now this one wasn't actually published until 1985. But the contents of this one were taken from Cicely Mary Barker's other works, the first one of which was Flower Fairies of the Spring, which was published in 1923. It's just such a cozy, wonderful, beautifully illustrated book of poems about nature during the winter. I highly recommend these. I just actually sent Flower Fairies of the Summer to one of my best friend's daughter. She's about 8 years old, and she just curled up with the book and read it from cover to cover and really loved it. And her mom now wants to get the other Flower Fairies, the other seasons. I particularly recommend Flower Fairies for the winter because when you're indoors in the wintertime and you're cooped up and you're not getting outside, it's nice to bring a little bit of nature to your side where you can just sit and read it and cozy up and look forward to the spring. It helps get through those long winter months, I feel. Cicely Mary Barker was born in Surrey, England, and I read that she suffered from epilepsy and had rather delicate health her entire life. I also found it interesting that one of the things that inspired her was the Victorian obsession with fairies. I love opening this one up and just looking through it now and then. It's just such a treat for me. Here is some of the illustrations. That's the Song of the Pine Tree Fairy. I particularly love this one. It's the Box Tree Fairy. So yeah, that is Cicely Mary Barker's Flower Fairies of the Winter. Published in 1938 is Mr. Popper's Penguins by Richard and Florence Atwater. And this is such a lovely tale of comedy and rags to riches with wonderful themes of family and friendships and business and owning your own identity. It's set in Stillwater, Minnesota, and runs from September through to the next year till April. And because there is so much discussion of the North and South Poles and keeping penguins cold or cool, I think it's a great book to read during the winter months. And so much of it is actually set during the winter months as well. We follow Mr. Popper, who has always wanted to travel to far-off lands, and he keeps in touch with an Arctic explorer, Admiral Drake. And one day, Admiral Drake ships him a penguin, and the family has a great time with this penguin, and they become a bit of a sensation. After a while, this penguin, who they named Captain Cook after the famous British explorer, becomes quite ill, and they come to realize that he's actually lonely, and luckily there is a zoo not too far away who has a female penguin who's also having the same problems. And so the zoo sends the Poppers, the female penguin, and the two of them lay eggs, and the story takes off from there. I think it has great value in learning to deal with problems as they come along. At the back of the book, it explains how Richard Atwater fell ill while he was writing this and how his wife, Florence, had to finish it for him. It's illustrated by Robert Lawson, who you'd know from his collaboration with Munro Leaf on Ferdinand. But also I wanted to tell you about another collaboration he had with Munro Leaf, and that's Wee Gillis, which is just one of our favorite books to read. If you love Scottish humor, this is such a great book to read. Robert Lawson was born in New York but lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And his works are all over the place. I also think I have a Ben and Me that is illustrated by Robert Lawson. I love his artwork. Here's one of them. They couldn't tell the penguins apart, so they had to write their names on their back. That was Captain Cook. And then I really love this page that shows how the family grew. This was actually one of the very first books I read to my son, and he really liked it. When he was probably, I think I read it to him when he was probably about 4 years old. Mr. Popper's Penguins from the 1930s. Now we are in the 1940s, and published in 1942 is Snow Treasure by Marie McSwiggan. And this one is illustrated by Andre Leblanc. If you enjoy edge-of-your-seat, fast-paced reads that with old-fashioned values, this is a great book to read. It's a story about these Norwegian kids, 2 boys and 2 girls, and how they smuggled gold bullion past Nazi soldiers so that the gold could be shipped to America and kept safe. In the introduction, it talks about how there was a shipment that came in from Norway to Baltimore, but they are not actually sure that the events occurred as it is written here, but nonetheless, it is such a great story. Not only is this a great book to read during the winter, but it's also a great introduction to the events of World War II, because it's a rather gentle introduction to the events of the war. It's really just the right amount for children. Even though it was from the 1940s, I feel this one works well with contemporary kids, not only because it's fast-paced, but also because the kids are led by not only 2 boys, but also 2 girls. And so it appeals to both genders. It also has some light lessons in Norwegian culture. It's illustrated by Andre Leblanc, who was born in Haiti, lived in New York for a while, and then retired to Brazil. And the illustrations are just wonderful. 1 full page. Published in 1942, Snow Treasure. So now we are in the 1950s, and published in 1958 is The Great Mouse Detective, Basil of Baker Street by Eve Titus. And this is a mystery set during frigid, blustery, cold weather. We have Basil and his trusty right-hand mouse, Mr. David Q. Dawson, who very often scuttle into the library where they hear Sherlock Holmes deduce and solve his mysteries. They are in complete awe of Sherlock Holmes. Basil and his trusty friend have been approached by a family who have lost their twin mouselings, and they beg him to please help them find their children. In this book, you will have educated deduction, disguise, traps as the 2 mice make their way through snowy, ice-cold forests. I really love the references to Sherlock Holmes, especially this one bit where Sherlock Holmes plays Paganini and Mendelssohn on his violin, and Basil tries to emulate that himself, but his music is not even close to being as good as Sherlock Holmes' music. It's really rather cute. At the end of the book, it's written, "Sir, you are the world's greatest detective. The second greatest, Mrs. Judson. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, of course, ranks the first." The illustrations by Paul Galdone are marvelous. We know Paul Galdone's work very well from his fairy tales and folk tales series. Paul Galdone was born in Budapest and moved to New York in 1928. Here are some of his illustrations, and this one as well. Now we are in the 1960s, and the book I'd like to recommend for read aloud is Roald Dahl's Charlie in the Chocolate Factory. And I have this 40th anniversary edition that I picked up at a used bookstore in Canada. This one is illustrated, of course, by Quentin Blake. And we follow Charlie, who is living with 2 sets of grandparents and his parents in abject poverty. They are living on cabbage soup with a double helping on Sundays. And there's a local chocolate factory, and as he walks by, he can smell the chocolate coming out of the chimney. And it is announced that 5 golden tickets are hidden in chocolate bars around the world, and the winner gets to go inside the chocolate factory and also win a lifetime supply of chocolate. Charlie just really wants to win this, although he knows his chances are very slim. And one by one, the golden tickets are found. And it's on a very cold, snowy day that Charlie finds a coin and buys himself the chocolate that has the golden ticket in it. I especially recommend this as a read aloud, not only because it's great to revisit the story with your children, but also because there are some outdated ways of viewing other people that you can either omit or discuss as you read it, however you see fit. And of course, Quentin Blake's illustrations are throughout. I love this version, and it's colorized, and the pages are colored too. Here, I wanted to read you the part where he finds the money. Then, one afternoon, walking back home with the icy wind in his face, and incidentally feeling hungrier than he had ever felt before, his eye was caught suddenly by something silvery lying in the gutter, in the snow. Charlie stepped off the curb and bent down to examine it. Part of it was buried under the snow, but he saw at once what it was. I wanted to recommend this for winter because of that scene that I thought was just so wonderful. But yeah, it really was great to revisit the story with my son when I read it, and it's one of my favorite all-time stories. Roald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, 1960. Now we are in the 1970s, and the book I want to recommend for the 1970s, published in 1978, is Great Canadian Animal Stories, 16 stories by 16 masters, edited by Muriel Whitaker. And I went back and forth on whether I should recommend this book or not, because these stories in here are definitely not always cozy. They're stories of survival, they're harsh, they're wild, and they're rough. I am actually somebody who enjoys reading children's literature more for the wisdom that is gained from the simplicity of storytelling. Very often when you read children's literature, especially children's literature that has become classic, there's always such beautiful pieces of wisdom to be found. And that's really my primary reason for reading children's literature. I love a good survival story in the winter, and the majority of these stories are survival stories. Beautifully written, stark, full of gorgeous winter scenery, gritty. If ever there's a time to pick up this book, it's during the winter, as so many of the stories are set against the harshness of snow and ice. Like Bambi or Cold Moons, or a book that I just recently read, The Fox and the Hound, these stories contain a great deal of death, but the writing has a greatness to it that makes the journey so worthwhile. There are 16 stories in this anthology, and they are not fluffy, and so I recommend them for adults or for older children. But if you are willing to give it a chance, this book contains some of the most beautiful stories set in the Canadian wilderness or in Canadian small towns. There's a story in here by Farley Mowat, who you would know, Owls in the Family. I spoke of this one in my spring Read a Book by the Decade. And then there's also one by Sheila Burnford, who you know from The Incredible Journey, which I spoke about this in my autumn Read a Book by the Decade. And there's also an excerpt from White Fang by Jack London in here. Some of the stories in here are by First Nations authors such as Grey Owl, and have First Nations origin stories or pourquoi tales, such as a tale which tell how humans got the first fire, which incidentally also explains how deer have black on the insides of their legs. And they're really beautiful. And there's another one by Charles G.D. Roberts, which is titled On the Roof of the World. And that is a story of a hunter and a polar bear that cross paths, and the aurora borealis is flashing and gives them enough light here and there for very quick survival instincts to kick in. It's just a beautiful, beautiful collection of stories. And it's illustrated by Vlasta Van Camp, and her illustrations are gorgeous, just beautiful. So by the way, you have to get the hard cover to get the color illustrations. The soft cover only has the black and white illustrations in them. Isn't that gorgeous? Here's a story from On the Roof of the World that I told you about. And this is from another beautiful story called The Call of the Tame, which I also love this story a lot. This is one by Grey Owl, the First Nations author who told the tale of a beaver who spent the winter with him. I wanted to read you this part right here that really explains the type of stories there are. The selections in this anthology have been chosen to show the variety of relationships that have existed between man and animal in a Canadian setting. Although some of the authors are British or American, all have written about Canadian animals in the Canadian wilderness where living creatures struggle for existence. Vlasta Van Kampen was an illustrator and author and teacher from Ontario, and in addition to illustrating great Canadian animal stories, she also illustrated great Canadian adventure stories. And I believe her artwork was featured on Canadian stamps, as well as many murals. I really love her style. It's a really beautiful book. Old, it's out of print. You have to buy it secondhand. But if you can find it and it's not too expensive, definitely go for the hard copy because it has the color illustrations. So now we're in the 1980s, and published in 1980 is a book by John Reynolds Gardner, Stone Fox. Stone Fox is an overcoming the monster story with a bit of a twist. John Reynolds Gardner says at the back of the book how the idea for the story came to him from a Rocky Mountain legend, It is also a competition story. If you love that seat of your pants feeling as you watch a competition at the end, it is great for winter because even though it begins in autumn during the harvest season, most of it is set during a harsh, cold winter. Let me read this passage to you. It's easy to tell when it's winter in Wyoming. There is snow on everything, the trees, the houses, the roads, the fields, and even the people, if they stay outside long enough. It's not a dirty snow, it's a clean, soft snow that rests like a blanket over the entire state. The air is clear and crisp and the rivers are all frozen. It's fun to be outdoors and see the snowflakes float down past the brim of your hat and hear the squeak of the fresh powder under your boots. I loved that. We follow a little boy who lives with his grandfather, and one day his grandfather is taken ill and he just won't get out of bed. And the boy goes for the doctor, but the doctor basically discovers that it's really just depression. And we come to find out that the reason is that his grandfather has insurmountable debts that he just doesn't know how to pay, back taxes on the house. The little boy has a dog named Searchlight, and the little boy comes across a flyer advertising a competition, a sledding competition, and decides to enter it with his dog, Searchlight. It's a simple story and it's short and it's easy to read, but it really packs a punch. When I did my very first Read a Book by the Decade, I was talking about the Black Stallion and how similar the Black Stallion is to the first Cars movie. My son went through a stage where he really enjoyed the Cars universe, and with Lightning McQueen and Doc Hudson, this book is quite similar in its plot. And so if you have a child who loves the Cars universe, this would be a good one for them. But I would say that the age is 7 and up, and I would stick with 7 and up. The illustrations are by Greg Hargreaves, and I had a hard time finding anything about him, but I did notice that he did illustrate some stories by O. Henry as well. Let me show you a couple of those illustrations. Here's one of them. Here's another one. Just a wonderful, quick read that really packs a punch. I highly recommend it. Stone Fox. So now we're in the 1990s, and finding a book in this decade was a bit of a challenge because if we weren't reading Harry Potter, then we were reading some other book that has nothing to do with wintertime. The Golden Compass or The Giver might have been great choices for this decade, but I haven't read them yet, so obviously couldn't recommend them. But then I realized that I do actually have a book that I feel could fit for winter, even though it's technically set at either an indeterminate season or maybe even summer, because it starts out on a beach, and that is A Series of Unfortunate Events. And the reason I thought it works for winter is because it's about 3 children trying to survive after they lose their parents and they lose their home. And as I said before, I love a good survival story in the winter. Plus, Count Olaf is so bleak and eccentric. He just gives me this sort of winter feel, almost like a sort of a winter time, the way Dracula almost fits into winter. Autumn could work as well, I suppose, but there's just something about these that makes me think of winter. I also thought to recommend them because there's 13 books in the series, and you would have to double up 1 month, but you could start in January with A Bad Beginning and read the rest of the books throughout the year, especially since the Lunar New Year of the Snake is coming up, and the second book in the series is The Reptile Room. Last year we tried to gear our reading towards dragons because it was the Lunar New Year of the dragons, and which wasn't hard because there are a ton of dragon books. But there are less snake books, especially if you've already read The Jungle Book and Rikki Tikki Tavi and Just So Stories and all that. I'm trying to find more snake books out there, so if you guys know any and have any recommendations, let me know. We have 3 children, Violet, Klaus, and Sunny, and they go to the beach one day, and while they're at the beach, they lose everything, their parents, their home, and they get sent to the only living relative that has been found, which is a very strange, eccentric relative by the name of Count Olaf, who has different motives for taking them in. And it's rather creepy. I will say we actually read this book a year ago already, the first one, and we haven't picked up the second one just because my son was a little creeped out by Count Olaf. So I thought I would just let it rest and give him a little bit of time. But I think now, this year, he's ready to move on with the series. They're illustrated by Brett Hellquist, who grew up in Utah but now lives in New York City. And I know him from when I did my Christmas Carol Illustrator Explorer. I love his adapted version of the Christmas Carol. I love his illustrations in that adapted version, I mean. And I also came across another book that he illustrated that I really want to read, and that's The Mona Lisa Vanishes, which was making the rounds during middle grade March last year, and I never got to it, but I would really like to read it this year. I wanted to show you one illustration. I did find one illustration from the second book that has the snow, and it's a zombie in the snow. So I thought to show that to you. But yeah, so we're going to read this in February, right after we get into the Lunar New Year of the Snake, so that'll be really fun. A Series of Unfortunate Events by Lemony Snicket, 1990s. Now we are in the 2000s, and published in 2009 is Odd and the Frost Giants by Neil Gaiman, illustrated by Chris Riddell. This is set on a small island in Norway, and it's during a winter that never ends. It's actually March, it's the end of March, and spring is not yet in sight. And we follow Odd, who is a boy with a shattered leg. He's on crutches, and one day he's approached by a fox who seems to want him to follow him, and he follows the fox, and he comes to a bear who's caught in a trap, and he frees the bear. There's also an eagle flying nearby, and they follow him home, and events occur that change the life of Odd for the better. It's one of those books that has several different plots. It's a little bit coming of age, it's a little bit overcoming the monster, it's a little bit there and back again. If you have a kid who's really into the Thor universe and loves Thor and Odin and Loki, then this will be a great book to read with them. They'll really enjoy it. There's also some really great funny moments between Thor and Loki in this book that they'll love and you'll love as well. I wanted to read a small passage to you just so you can get a feel for how the book is written. This is in regards to the Rainbow Bridge to Asgard as it's opening up. Scarlet fell softly about them, and everything was outlined in greens and blues, and the world was raspberry-colored and leaf-colored and golden-colored and fire-colored and blueberry-colored and wine-colored. Odd's world was colors, and despite his crutch, he could feel himself falling forward, tumbling into the rainbow. Neil Gaiman is just amazing. I love his writing. Chris Riddell's illustrations are phenomenal, and this metallic ink that is used is just wonderful. I don't have another book that has this. I've only seen it in this one. Full page spreads. There's the bear. There's the three of them as they go along. I'll show you some more of the metallic ink so you can see it. This book actually has at least two other illustrators. Brett Hellquist, who I just spoke about, illustrates a version, and I saw that one. It's actually quite nice as well. There's also one by Mark Buckingham, I think it is, who illustrates a version. But I really like this one by Chris Riddell. It's stunning, and my son really loved this book, and so did I. It's a great story and perfect for winter, especially as winter is turning into spring. Published in 2013 is The Adventures of a South Pole Pig by Chris Kurtz. And this was such a delightful read. We read this a few years ago. We have Flora, who is a pig who wants to have adventure. She decides to join some sled dogs and join an expedition to Antarctica, to the South Pole. And she doesn't realize that she's been taken along for other reasons, you know. So she's actually meant to be dinner. But once she realizes this, she comes up with a plan and a way to help herself, to save her own life. And it's full of adventure. There's this very exciting part where they're on the ship sailing to Antarctica, and there's a storm, and my son was loving it, and he wanted one more chapter, please. I couldn't recommend it enough. It's illustrated by Jennifer Black Reinhardt, and she grew up in Pennsylvania in a family of artists, and she has illustrated many children's books. She has a new book coming out soon called Moving Day, which is a story of a Victorian home that's being moved from the home's perspective, which looks really cute. Let me show you some of these illustrations. By the way, it just started snowing. I don't know if you've seen me glancing out that way. There's a window there, and the flakes are really big and beautiful. But anyway, so there's one of the illustrations, and here's a really cute one of Flora in the snow. A really cute middle grade book, 2010's The Adventure of a South Pole Pig. So now we are in the final decade, the 2020s, and before I show you the book that I wanted to recommend to you, I just wanted to give a shout out to The Wild Robot Protects. Perfect book for winter because it's set up in the Arctic and includes species that you find in the north, such as the Greenland shark, which is a very, very long-lived shark. Each one of these gets better than the one before it. And so yeah, and this one would be a great one to read in the wintertime. Because I've already spoken about the wild robots so much on this channel, I thought I would give another option for a winter read. And this one has parts that are set in a very cold environment. And I am talking about A Rover's Story by Jasmine Warga. A Rover's story is literally about resilience, and it's told from the Rover's perspective, whose name is Resilience, or Rez for short. Oh, by the way, in The Wild Robot, her name is Roz, and this one is Rez. And I recommend it for children who love science, who love planets, and also for children who might be dealing with parents who have to work long hours. It starts off with Rez describing being born, coming to consciousness. There's two engineers, and one of them is a mother of Sophie. And Sophie misses her mom. She doesn't get to see her mom very often because her mom is busy building resilience. And she begins coping with it by writing letters to Resilience. And the letters continue on through the book as Resilience is completed and launched into space with his drone Fly, and they land on Mars. There's some really exciting bits, especially when they're landing on Mars and when they're exploring Mars. I do want to point out it does have some emotional bits to it. Also, I wanted to point out something that was important for us, I wish we had known, just because it would have helped us enjoy it even more. And that is only about a third of the book actually occurs on the planet Mars. So just for expectation compatibility, I thought I would mention that. We purchased this for a friend of ours who's really into space, and he loved it as well. It is really well researched and absolutely fascinating. The cover and interior artwork is by Matt Rockefeller, and there are only illustrations at the beginning of a part, and there are 5 parts, so you have 5 full-page spreads, but they are rather wonderful. Here's another one for you. Matt Rockefeller's from the Pacific Northwest, and I really love his artwork and style. But yep, so that is 2020's A Rover Story. I like to recommend a graphic novel to end off these lists, and I am actually ashamed that I have never spoken about this graphic novel series, which is also a Netflix show, so many of you probably know this one already. And it is Luke Pearson's Hilda and the Troll. And Hilda and her adventures and the friends she meets. It's so fresh, it's brilliant, it's sweet, it's original. I can't even explain how happy these books make me when we read them. Hilda is just this wonderful, conscientious character who is just very, very kind. She's an only child who lives with her mom, and in the first book she comes across a troll, and she's extremely scared of this troll. She comes to understand the troll and finds out that he's actually not that scary and actually an endearing character. And so many of her adventures are exactly that. They're creatures that she's afraid of, that when she opens up her mind and she tries to understand them and look at them from a different perspective, they prove to be wonderful characters or not so scary monsters after all. And we just love them. And I've got the first 4, Hilda and the Troll, Hilda and the Midnight Giant, Hilda and the Bird Parade, and Hilda and the Black Hound. And there's 7 in the series. We've taken to watching it on Netflix as well, because there is just the most catchy tune ever for the intro. And it's just wonderful. It's really cool. There's also great characters like the Woodman. We love the Woodman. He's this just very strange character who comes in and out of stories. Oh, there's my little red squirrel. Let me show you one of the illustrations from Hilda and the Troll. Let me put these down for a second. I love this one with the house by itself in the mountains, as well as this one here. And one of my favorite things that she says, whenever things go wrong or whenever she looks back on whatever experience she just had, she says, "Such is the life of an adventurer." And I just love that. It's just a wonderful, wonderful series. I highly recommend it. And I love it for the winter time because Hilda, with her scarf and her sweater and her boots, even if there's no snow on the ground, it always makes me think of winter. And I also believe it's up north because a lot of the monsters in this series are common northern monsters, Scandinavian monsters from myths and legends. So that's pretty cool as well. So yep, my graphic novel recommendation, Hilda and the Troll. That is it. I hope you have enjoyed this snapshot of some of the books that we have read in our reading list, the winter themed books. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of them, and also just let me know how your 2025 is going. I'd love to hear from you guys. If you're new to my channel, I try to get out a video every second Saturday and at the latest every third Saturday. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe so that you'll get notification next time I have a video up. Until then, I hope you guys keep well, and I'll see you real soon in my next video. Bye!